In the rolling hills of Transylvania, nestled between craggy mountain ridges and dense forests, a mysterious tradition persisted for generations, one so strange that it would spark fear and fascination in those who heard of it. The story begins with a question that may leave you unsettled. What happens when a family dares to defy the conventional norms of death and burial? The family at the center of this eerie tale didn't follow the widely accepted practices of their time, choosing instead to bury their dead without the customary coffins. It wasn't a one-time anomaly, but rather a ritual passed down through the generations, casting an air of dread and intrigue over the rural villages of Transylvania. The year is 1801, and the Transylvanian countryside is a land steeped in superstition, mystery, and a rigid adherence to ancient customs. It is a place where the boundary between the living and the dead feels disturbingly thin. In these remote villages, people still believed in spirits, curses, and supernatural forces that could be summoned by the dead if not properly appeased. The customs surrounding death were sacred, their sanctity preserved by local religious leaders, healers, and even the occasional witch. But the family in question, whose name was lost to time, ignored all of this. They chose a path of their own, one that was deeply rooted in ancient practices that made no sense to the outside world. It started with a simple, yet profoundly unsettling, act: the burial of a deceased family member without a coffin. To most, the idea of burying the dead in such a way would have been seen as not just disrespectful but terrifying. A proper coffin was not merely a vessel to contain the body, it was a barrier between the living and the dead, a sacred safeguard against the unholy forces that could be unleashed by improper burial practices. But for this family, the concept of a coffin was irrelevant. Instead of embracing what was considered normal, they adhered to something far older, something lost in time, even to those who lived in the shadow of their rituals. This practice was not a one-off event, nor was it an act of desperation. It was the beginning of a tradition, passed down through generations, a secret lineage of ritualistic burials that defied all reason. Each time death struck, the family repeated the same act: no coffins. The deceased were laid to rest directly in the earth, the body uncovered, exposed, left to merge with the soil in a way that most of the villagers found horrifying. For outsiders, the practice seemed to come from a place of madness or defiance. And yet, the family persisted, each generation continuing what had begun long before them, as if bound by some unspoken oath. The reactions from the local community were mixed, but overall, one thing was clear: fear. The villagers whispered about the family in hushed tones, speculating about the reasons behind their strange rituals. Some saw them as outcasts, perhaps cursed or touched by dark forces beyond human comprehension. Others, though, looked at the family with a sense of awe, as though they were following a path that was both sacred and forbidden. These villagers may have believed that the family was engaged in a type of religious or mystical practice, something passed down from a time when the boundaries between life and death were not so rigidly defined. But no matter the interpretation, the result was the same: fear, mystery, and a sense of otherworldliness that surrounded the family like a shroud. The lack of a coffin was seen as an affront to the very concept of burial and a breach of the sacred rites of death. In this time and place, a proper burial was more than just a ritual. It was a crucial element in the transition of the soul from the realm of the living to that of the dead. A coffin was supposed to protect the body, to ensure that the soul could pass peacefully into the afterlife, free from a chance of being disturbed by malevolent spirits or the possibility of the body returning as something other than human. The family's decision to forego this sacred protection was more than just an oddity. It was a deliberate act of defiance against the established order. The mystery surrounding this family grew not only because of their burial practices but also because of the secrecy they kept. No one knew the full extent of their beliefs or the reasons behind their decisions. It wasn't as if they openly spoke about their traditions. They kept them hidden, buried along with their dead. This sense of secrecy only added to their enigma. It was said that the family never explained why they chose to bury their dead without coffins. To them, it was simply how things were done, a part of their ancestral customs that ran so deep it transcended words. But the rest of the community had no such understanding, and over time, stories began to spread. Some claimed that the family had a special connection to the dead, a spiritual bond that allowed them to communicate with spirits in ways that others could not. Others whispered that the family was cursed, doomed to follow these strange rituals until the end of time. In an age where death was seen as something to be feared and respected, the family's actions made them outliers, and perhaps even pariahs. The villagers, who had their own deeply held beliefs about the sanctity of burial rites, began to see the family's practices as a threat. But what could be the reason behind such a refusal to follow the normal course of things? Was it a family tradition passed down for centuries, or something darker? Were they keeping a secret, one that could shatter the fragile understanding of life and death in their world? And if so, what was the price they had paid for this defiance? There was a certain eeriness in how the family operated in the shadows. While others carried out their funerals in the light of day, with clergy, mourners, and solemn prayers, the family's burials were quiet affairs. No public mourning took place. No priests were called. No neighbors gathered to offer their respects. Instead, it was as if the family preferred to keep their acts of death and burial cloaked in secrecy, a final moment shared only by the immediate family, perhaps under the cover of darkness. The lack of a coffin was the most obvious symbol of their strange ways, but it was not the only thing that set them apart. Over the years, rumors spread of the strange customs that surrounded their funerals. Some claimed that the bodies were placed in the earth in a manner that suggested some kind of ritual or ceremony, but no one could confirm the details. The only thing that was certain was that the family's burials left behind a sense of unease, an unanswered question that lingered in the minds of those who witnessed them. But why? Why would this family choose such a bizarre and disturbing tradition? Was it out of a deep-seated belief in some kind of ancient ritual, or was there something more? Perhaps it was a matter of family pride, a desire to hold on to an ancient tradition, no matter how unsettling it might appear to others. Or maybe there was something more hidden beneath the surface, some secret so terrifying that it could not be spoken aloud. As the years passed, the family's strange practice continued, becoming an enduring mystery in the annals of Transylvanian folklore. No clear answers emerged, and with each generation, the tale of the family that buried its dead without coffins became more and more of a legend. Some speculated that the family had made a pact with forces beyond human understanding, binding themselves to an unspoken agreement that they would follow the ritual, regardless of the consequences. Others believed the family was trying to break free from the normal cycles of life and death, seeking some kind of immortality or transcendence that lay beyond the grave. But in the end, no one knew for sure. The mystery only deepened with time, leaving behind a legacy of fear and curiosity. This family, so different from the rest, continues to haunt the shadows of history. Their burial practices, so unsettling and incomprehensible, have left an indelible mark on the collective memory of those who have heard their story. What drove them to such extremes? Was it faith, fear, or something far darker? As the years go by, the answers to these questions remain elusive, and the mystery of the family who buried their dead without coffins continues to captivate those who dare to ask what lies beyond the veil of life and death. Transylvania in the early 1800s was a land where time seemed to stand still. It was a place that evoked images of craggy mountain ranges, dark, dense forests, and ancient castles, a region where superstition held sway over the hearts and minds of its inhabitants. The air was thick with the weight of history, as if the very land itself had absorbed centuries of dark tales and blood-soaked secrets. Villages were small and isolated, tucked away in valleys or perched on the edges of vast, untamed forests. Life was often harsh and unforgiving, shaped by the unforgiving natural landscape and the equally unforgiving customs that governed every aspect of existence. In a time before modern medicine, scientific discoveries, or widespread literacy, Transylvanians depended heavily on their traditions, beliefs, and folklore to make sense of the world around them. It was a world where the lines between reality and myth often blurred, where mysterious phenomena could be explained by invoking the supernatural, and where death itself was a subject surrounded by ritual and superstition. To die was to leave behind not only the body but also the soul, something that needed to be carefully shepherded to the afterlife to prevent it from wandering the earth in search of rest. In this world, proper burial was seen as paramount. It was a right, a duty, and above all, a necessity. But in the midst of all this, there existed a family whose burial practices defied everything that was considered sacred. In the villages of Transylvania, the traditions surrounding death were strictly adhered to. The priest, the local healer, and even the village elder played an important role in the rituals that accompanied death. For the people of this land, death was not just an end. It was a passage, a transition from the physical world to the spiritual realm. How one died, and how one was buried, held great importance. A proper burial was thought to ensure the soul's safe passage, and a coffin, crafted with care and reverence, was believed to protect the body and soul alike. The coffin was an essential part of this ritual, a final safeguard against the dangers that might befall the dead. Without a coffin, it was said, the soul could not rest. It would wander, lost and restless, possibly even returning to the living world as an undead spirit, a vampire, or some other nightmarish being. But amid this tightly bound belief system, there was one family whose actions shocked the sensibilities of their community. Their burial practices, which involved burying their dead without the customary coffin, would leave a mark on the region's history and folklore. It was a tradition so strange and disturbing that it could only be understood within the context of the culture and time in which it occurred. And yet, the origins of this practice remained shrouded in mystery, even as the years passed. The world in which this family lived was one that was still deeply tied to ancient customs. In Transylvania, time did not flow in the same way it did in other parts of Europe. The cultural fabric of this region had been shaped by centuries of invasions, wars, and foreign rulers, and it had woven together a patchwork of beliefs that incorporated elements from Christianity, ancient paganism, and other local traditions. The people were superstitious and deeply religious, their lives governed by rituals that provided a sense of control over the world around them. To die in Transylvania was to undergo a process of passage, but it was also to engage with a much larger, more mysterious world. The dead were not simply gone, they lingered, they watched, and they had the power to affect the living. In this world, the idea of a family breaking away from these customs was unthinkable. To the average villager, there was no room for deviation. The social fabric was tightly knit, and to step outside of accepted practices was to invite suspicion, fear, and potentially, ostracism. In this sense, the family's burial customs stood as a stark contrast to the world around them. While everyone else adhered to the rules, this family seemed to reject them altogether. Their decision to bury their dead without coffins was not only an affront to religious and social conventions, but it also signaled something much deeper, a break with the world of the living and an embrace of something that could not be easily understood. The family's isolation, both physical and cultural, only deepened the mystery surrounding their practices. Located in a remote corner of the Transylvanian countryside, the family lived in a small, almost forgotten village, a place where few outsiders ventured. The village was perched on the edge of a thick, dark forest, where the trees seemed to whisper in the wind and the very air seemed charged with an otherworldly energy. The family's house was set apart from the others, a rambling, weather-worn building that appeared older than the surrounding structures. It was said that the house had been built long ago by the family's ancestors, who had lived in the area for generations. The house was surrounded by a small, overgrown graveyard, the final resting place of the family's dead. It was in this place that the family's strange burial practices took root. What made the family's actions all the more puzzling was that there was no clear explanation for why they chose to bury their dead without coffins. No one knew for certain why they had adopted this practice. The family, for their part, never spoke about it. It was as if the act of burying their dead without coffins was a given, something so ingrained in their way of life that it needed no explanation. The village, too, remained silent on the matter. The family was not exactly ostracized, but neither were they welcomed with open arms. They were tolerated, but they were seen as outsiders, as people whose customs did not align with the rest of society. Some suggested that the family's actions were tied to some ancient, forgotten ritual, a practice that had been passed down through the generations. Perhaps it was a tradition that predated Christianity, a pagan custom that had been kept alive by the family as a form of ancestral reverence. Others speculated that the family was involved in some form of occult or mystical practice. There were rumors that the family believed they could communicate with the dead, and that the act of burying their deceased without coffins was a way to maintain a connection with the spirit world. The lack of a coffin, in this theory, was not seen as a disrespectful act but as a way to allow the dead to continue their journey in the afterlife, unencumbered by earthly constraints. Still, there were others who believed that the family's refusal to use coffins was a form of rebellion, a deliberate act of defiance against the accepted customs of society. Perhaps, they thought, the family was making a statement, a rejection of the conventions that had been imposed on them by the church, by the authorities, and by the wider community. To bury their dead without coffins was to cast off the shackles of tradition, to embrace a more personal and intimate form of ritual. But whether this was an act of rebellion, superstition, or spiritual belief, no one knew for sure. One thing was certain: the family's burial practices were a mystery that would never be fully explained. They lived in a world where the boundaries between the living and the dead were fluid, where the natural world and the supernatural coexisted side by side. Their actions were a reflection of this world, a world where death was not simply a biological fact but a deeply spiritual event, one that required careful attention, reverence, and, above all, adherence to tradition. Yet, The family's rejection of that tradition left a void, a question mark that would remain unanswered for generations. As the years passed, the family's practices became a source of legend. Stories of their strange burials spread throughout the region, whispered in the dark corners of taverns and around the firesides of villages. Some spoke of the family with fear and awe, while others dismissed their practices as the ravings of a mad family. But regardless of how the family was viewed, one thing was clear: their actions were something that could not be easily forgotten. The mystery of the family who buried their dead without coffins remained, and it continues to echo through the centuries, a dark and puzzling enigma that refuses to fade into the past. The family at the heart of this mystery was no ordinary family, and their story is one that has passed through the shadows of time, growing more enigmatic with each retelling. Although much about them remains lost to history, the fragments that have survived paint a picture of a family deeply bound by a set of beliefs and customs that set them apart from the world around them. Their names, their faces, and many of their personal stories have faded, but their legacy, one defined by the strange and ritualistic burials that have captivated the imaginations of many, remains alive in the whispers of Transylvanian folklore. This family, living in a small and secluded village in the heart of Transylvania, appeared, at first glance, to be much like any other rural family of their time. They lived in a modest, weather-beaten house, situated on the edge of the forest, where the trees seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The house itself, though humble, had an air of antiquity, with its time-worn beams and thick stone walls. The property was surrounded by a small cemetery, its gravestones worn and crumbling, much like the family's history. It was here, amid the growing overgrowth, that the family buried their dead, without coffins, a practice that would ultimately define them in the eyes of the community. The family's ancestors had lived in this area for generations, a lineage that stretched back to an era when Transylvania was still deeply tied to ancient pagan customs and the mystic beliefs of its early inhabitants. Their roots ran deep into the soil of the land, a connection that seemed unbroken by the passage of time. These ancestors were believed to be a part of a long-forgotten tradition, one that bound them to the earth in ways the outside world could never fully understand. The family carried this tradition with them, a legacy that seemed to be their sole inheritance, passed down from generation to generation like an unspoken oath. Yet, as time went on, this sacred bond with the land, and with the dead, would set them on a path that would eventually alienate them from the rest of society. The family, as outsiders in their own way, were not part of the mainstream social fabric of the village. They were viewed with a mix of suspicion, awe, and fear by their neighbors. Their way of life was different, their beliefs even more so. They did not conform to the norms that governed the rest of the village. Where most families followed the Christian burial rites, prescribed by the church and the local priest, this family chose their own method, one that appeared ancient, even primal. There were no church services, no priests reciting prayers, and no coffins to encase the dead. Instead, the body would be laid directly in the earth, without ceremony, and covered by the soil. To the outside world, this was nothing short of sacrilege. The family's strange practices were not born out of rebellion, nor were they the product of ignorance or neglect. They followed a deeply ingrained spiritual belief that governed their actions, a belief that was rooted in a connection to the land and the unseen forces that surrounded them. It was as if their customs were dictated by something older than Christianity, something that existed long before the church had established its dominance over the people of Transylvania. The family, with their dark eyes and weathered faces, seemed to carry the weight of this ancient wisdom, a wisdom that could not be easily understood by those who were tied to the more modern religious beliefs of the time. There was something deeply personal about their connection to death, something beyond the simple rituals of burial. To the family, death was not an event to be feared or mourned in the traditional sense. It was a passage, but also a continuation, a journey into another realm that could not be understood by those living in the world of the living. They believed that the dead were not truly gone, that their spirits remained close by, watching over their descendants, offering guidance, and protecting the family. This was not a belief held by the broader community, and in fact, it was seen as strange and unsettling. The family did not view death as an end, but as a transformation, an elevation to a higher plane, where the deceased could remain a part of the family's legacy and watch over their loved ones from the beyond. It was this belief that led them to reject the common burial practices of their village. To bury a person with a coffin, they believed, was to trap the soul, to imprison it in the earthly realm. Instead, they laid their dead directly in the earth, allowing the body to return to the soil and the spirit to continue its journey. The burial was not an end but a return to the beginning, a return to the land that had given birth to their family. In their eyes, the soul was already free, and the coffin would only hinder its passage. Over time, the family's practices began to attract attention. The first incident that truly set them apart from the rest of the village occurred when the first known member of the family died under unusual circumstances. Unlike the typical burials, which were marked by the solemnity of a funeral and the gathering of mourners, this death went largely unnoticed by the outside world. The body was laid to rest without ceremony, without the usual prayers or funeral rites. Instead, the family gathered in silence around the grave, laid the body in the earth, and covered it with soil. There were no outsiders involved in the process, no one to witness the strange act. It was as if the family believed the burial to be a private affair, something that should remain within the family's domain. When word of the death, and the peculiar burial, began to spread, the community's reaction was one of horror and confusion. At first, there were whispers among the villagers, murmurs about the family's strange practices, but no one dared to confront them directly. As the years passed and more family members died, their burial practices became the subject of increasing gossip and suspicion. People began to wonder if the family was cursed, if their refusal to conform to established customs was a sign of madness or worse. There were even rumors of supernatural forces at work. Some claimed the family had made a pact with dark forces, while others suggested that the family's ancestors had been practitioners of witchcraft or pagan rituals long lost to history. The family, however, paid little attention to the whispers of the villagers. They continued their practices, seemingly unaffected by the growing fear and confusion surrounding their customs. It was as if they were following an ancient calling, one that transcended the fleeting judgments of the community. They did not seek approval or recognition. They were bound to their tradition by something far more powerful than the opinions of their neighbors. The village, however, could not ignore the growing sense of unease that accompanied every new burial. Each time another family member died, and another body was laid to rest without a coffin, the community became more and more alarmed. As the family's practices persisted, they began to attract the attention of outside authorities. The local priest, who had long been wary of the family's unorthodox beliefs, made several attempts to intervene. He sought to convince them to adopt the traditional Christian burial rites, to allow the church to perform the necessary rituals for the deceased, and to ensure that the body was properly laid to rest in a coffin. But the family refused, each time asserting that their traditions were sacred and that they would not abandon the customs of their ancestors. The priest, frustrated and fearful of the implications of such defiance, could do little but watch as the family continued their ritual, undeterred by his protests. Eventually, the family's actions began to attract the attention of historians and anthropologists, who sought to understand the origins of this strange practice. Some speculated that the family's customs were rooted in ancient pagan rituals, while others believed that the practice had been passed down through generations as a way to preserve a unique spiritual bond with the land. No one, however, was able to pinpoint the true origins of the tradition, and as the years turned into decades, the family's practices continued to perplex and disturb those who encountered them. Despite the fear and curiosity they provoked, the family persisted in their strange and enigmatic customs. For them, the act of burying their dead without coffins was not a challenge to authority, nor was it an expression of rebellion. It was simply how things were done, a practice so deeply embedded in their way of life that it needed no explanation. They were bound by something much older than the societal norms that governed the rest of the world. Their practices, while unsettling to the outside world, were a reflection of their unwavering belief in the continuity between life and death, and the idea that death was not the end, but merely the next step in a long and unbroken cycle. The first reported incident that would forever cement the family's strange burial practices in the annals of local law occurred quietly, with no fanfare or public acknowledgement. It began with the death of an elder within the family, a man who, though already advanced in age, had lived a life that many in the village had respected. His passing was inevitable, but the way in which his death was handled would send ripples of fear and suspicion through the community that would endure for generations. No one could have predicted that this one event would set in motion a mystery that would never be fully explained, a mystery that would cause the family to be both revered and reviled, the subject of both awe and dread. The death occurred on a late autumn evening, a time when the leaves had fallen from the trees, and the cold winds of winter had begun to sweep across the land. The elderly man had lived a long life, filled with a quiet strength that had earned him respect from the few who had known him well. His passing was not unexpected, but it was the manner in which it was handled that set the event apart. Unlike the customary mourning rituals that were expected in the village, where the body would be washed, clothed, and placed in a coffin before being prepared for burial, the family chose a different course of action. When the elder died, there was no rush to call for the priest, no gathering of mourners, no prayers to be recited over the body. The family, as they had done for generations, kept the death within the confines of their home, shrouded in secrecy. In the quiet hours after the death, the body was laid out in a room that was not intended for viewing. There was no ornate preparation, no ritualistic dressing of the corpse. Instead, the body remained as it had been in life, undisturbed, with no sign of the customary embalming or washing that was the norm in the village. There was no question that this death, like the others before it, would be handled differently. The family had, over the years, perfected their own version of the burial rite, one that was foreign to their neighbors, one that was steeped in a history of secrecy and ritual, and one that defied all the social conventions of the day. As the night wore on, the family gathered quietly around the body. There was no crying, no wailing, no outward display of grief. The air was thick with a kind of reverence, a silence that bordered on the sacred. The relatives knew that the time had come, but it was not yet time to announce the death to the outside world. In the early hours of the morning, long before the sun had begun to rise, the family prepared for the next phase of the ritual, the burial. But this would not be a typical burial. This would be the first instance in which the family's strange tradition would be revealed to the villagers, who were already beginning to notice that something was amiss. The body was taken to the family's private cemetery, a place hidden in the shadows of the surrounding forest, a secluded area that few knew of, even fewer dared to visit. The cemetery was small, barely more than a collection of old, weather-beaten gravestones, each one worn and cracked by time. Some were so old that their inscriptions were indecipherable, while others were nearly forgotten, abandoned by the passing generations. It was in this quiet, isolated corner of the land that the family's dead were laid to rest, far from the prying eyes of the village. The burial itself was a quiet affair, with no public ceremony or display of religious rites. The family, knowing that they were defying societal expectations, took every care to ensure that their actions would remain as private as possible. But despite their best efforts to keep the burial secret, word began to spread quickly. It was inevitable. Rumors started circulating about the strange manner in which the elder had been buried. A few of the village children, who had wandered too close to the cemetery, had seen the unusual proceedings and quickly ran back to the village, breathless with excitement and fear. It wasn't long before whispers turned into full-blown rumors, and the entire village was abuzz with talk of the family's unorthodox burial practices. What had they done? Where was the coffin? Why had they not called the priest to perform the proper rites? These were the questions that fueled the fear and uncertainty of the villagers. At first, many thought it was some kind of misunderstanding. Surely, the family couldn't have broken with centuries of tradition. Maybe there had been an accident, or perhaps the family was in such grief that they had forgotten the proper rites. But as the hours passed, it became increasingly clear that this was not a mistake, it was intentional. The elder had been laid to rest without a coffin, a fact that no one could ignore. The fear that began to spread was not merely based on a lack of a coffin. It was a deeper, more visceral fear rooted in the knowledge that the family had chosen to act outside the norms of society, defying the very principles that govern death and burial. There was something unnatural, something unsettling about their refusal to follow the customs that had been established for centuries. The reaction of the villagers was swift and harsh. At first, there were whispered conversations behind closed doors. People spoke in hushed tones, careful not to be overheard. But as the day wore on, the fear grew louder. People began to ask each other, was the family cursed? Were they somehow connected to dark forces beyond human comprehension? Was it possible that the elder had been an evil spirit, and that the family's refusal to bury him with a coffin was an act of appeasement, a way to keep him from returning in a supernatural form? These questions echoed through the village, growing with each retelling, feeding into the growing sense of dread. The local priest, hearing the rumors, immediately went to the family's home to confront them. He arrived, grave and solemn, and demanded to speak with them about the unusual burial. The family, however, was not surprised by his visit. They had known that their actions would eventually attract attention, but they did not react with fear or remorse. Instead, they remained calm, even indifferent, to the priest's concerns. They explained that their burial practices were sacred, that they were a long-standing tradition passed down through the generations, and that they had always followed this path. For them, there was nothing wrong with what they had done. They had not broken any divine law. They had simply adhered to a set of beliefs that ran deeper than the rites imposed by the church. The priest, frustrated by the family's unwavering stance, attempted to persuade them to abandon their practices. He spoke of the dangers of straying from the accepted customs of burial, warning them of the consequences that might befall them and their loved ones if they continued down this path. He reminded them that their refusal to conform to the church's teachings was an affront to God, and that they risked damning themselves and their ancestors. But the family was unmoved by his words. They were not interested in conforming to the expectations of society. Their beliefs were not negotiable. They had chosen this path long ago, and no amount of pressure from the outside world would make them turn back. In the weeks that followed, the news of the elder's burial without a coffin spread far and wide. The family's practices became the subject of intense scrutiny, both from the local community and from outsiders who began to take an interest in the strange and mysterious family. Some saw them as heretics, while others viewed them as nothing more than a family of mad eccentrics, bound by their own irrational beliefs. But there were others still who saw the family as something more, perhaps as the last remaining vestige of a forgotten time, a time when ancient rites and customs held sway over the land. These outsiders, many of whom were scholars, historians, and anthropologists, sought to learn more about the family and their burial practices, believing that they were somehow connected to ancient, pagan rituals that had been lost to history. Despite the growing interest in the family's customs, one thing remained clear: the mystery surrounding their actions only deepened with time. The more people learned about the family, the more questions arose. What was their true motivation? What drove them to reject the conventions of society and adhere so steadfastly to their own beliefs? Was it simply a matter of family pride, or was there something more to their practices, something darker, something rooted in the very fabric of the land itself? As the years passed, the family continued to bury their dead without coffins, each act further reinforcing their place in the strange history of Transylvania. They became both a source of fear and fascination, a living testament to a time long past, when the boundaries between the living and the dead were not as clear-cut as they are today. And though the full truth of their practices may never be known, the first burial, the elder's death, was the spark that ignited a mystery that would endure for centuries, leaving behind only unanswered questions and a legacy that would haunt the region for generations to come. The family's burial practices, and the mystery surrounding them, only deepened with each passing generation. As more time passed, the village began to develop a collective sense of unease whenever death came knocking at the family's door. The practice of burying the dead without coffins, already seen as a peculiar tradition, became a source of both fear and curiosity. Each death, each burial, was marked by hushed whispers that spread like wildfire through the village. And yet, despite the growing apprehension, the family continued their rituals undisturbed. In fact, as time wore on, their practices seemed to grow even more entrenched, their beliefs more resolute, as if they were following some ancient, unbreakable code that was tied not just to their family but to the very land beneath their feet. As the family's reputation grew in the village, so too did the myths and legends that surrounded them. The villagers began to speculate about what could drive a family to such extreme measures. Some believed that the family was haunted by a curse, passed down through the generations. It was said that their ancestors had made a pact with some dark, otherworldly force, and the cost of that pact was to follow these strange and unsettling burial rites. Others whispered that the family had once been part of an ancient sect, long since disappeared, that had practiced an occult religion based on the belief that the soul could not be trapped in a coffin. According to this theory, the family's burial practices were not merely an act of rebellion but a form of worship, a sacred rite designed to ensure that the spirits of their ancestors could continue to guide and protect them from the unseen forces that lurked in the darkness. The family, for their part, never acknowledged these rumors, nor did they seek to dispel the myths. They did not care what the villagers thought of them. Their focus was always on the customs they had inherited, a legacy that was far more important than the approval of outsiders. They believed their way of life was sacred, passed down by their forebears, and they had no intention of abandoning it. To them, the lack of a coffin was not a mark of disrespect but an essential part of a tradition that had been in place for generations, perhaps even centuries. It was a practice they believed kept them connected to their ancestors, to the land, and to something far larger than the confines of their village. Their devotion to these customs was not limited to funerals and burials. The family's entire way of life seemed to revolve around a profound respect for the dead. Their rituals extended beyond the act of burial itself. They believed that the dead could influence the living, that the spirits of their ancestors were always present, watching over them, guiding them, even offering warnings when necessary. Every family member, from the youngest child to the eldest, was taught from a young age to honor the dead. It was said that the family would often gather together in silence, in the hours between dusk and dawn, to commune with the spirits of their ancestors. They would leave offerings, flowers, food, and small trinkets at the gravesites of their forebears, paying their respects and seeking guidance for the days ahead. The family's reverence for the dead was reflected in the way they lived their lives. Their house, though modest, was filled with symbols of the afterlife. There were old portraits of deceased ancestors hanging on the walls, their faces faded by time but still stern and watchful. The family had a collection of heirlooms, books, jewelry, and personal items that were passed down through generations, each item carrying with it the memory and the spirit of the one who had owned it. These relics were kept in a special room, a kind of ancestral chamber, where they were preserved with great care. The room itself had an almost sacred quality, as though the air was thick with the presence of the spirits that had once inhabited the family's bloodline. Even in their daily lives, the family adhered to a code that seemed to be rooted in respect for the past. They never spoke ill of the dead, and it was considered bad luck to challenge the decisions of an elder, even if that elder had been dead for decades. When the family discussed matters of great importance, it was common for them to consult the spirits of their ancestors, either through quiet prayer or by seeking omens in the natural world. It was said that the family had a deep understanding of nature, and they could read the signs that others would miss, whether it was the behavior of the animals, the pattern of the stars, or the wind on a particular day. Every element of nature, it seemed, was a message from the beyond, a whisper from the past that could guide their actions. But it wasn't just the family's rituals that set them apart from the village. Their isolation was another key factor. The family lived on the outskirts of the village, far removed from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Their house, though situated near the edge of the forest, was not easily accessible. The path leading to it was narrow, winding, and overgrown, making it a difficult journey for anyone who wasn't familiar with the area. This physical separation from the village reinforced the idea that the family was different, that they were somehow apart from the rest of society. The village itself, while quaint and picturesque, was a place where tradition reigned supreme, where customs were rigidly followed, and where anyone who stepped out of line risked being labeled as an outsider, even a heretic. Over time, the family's refusal to conform to the village's norms began to breed resentment. While some still respected them for their adherence to tradition, others viewed them with growing suspicion. It wasn't just their burial practices that caused unease, it was their refusal to participate in the everyday life of the village. The family did not attend village gatherings, they did not participate in the religious festivals, and they rarely spoke to outsiders. This isolation only added to their mystique, making them the subject of gossip and speculation. The villagers began to ask questions that no one dared answer. Was the family hiding something? What were they really doing in those quiet hours between dusk and dawn? What secrets did they keep locked away in their ancestral chamber? The most unsettling rumors concerned the family's ability to communicate with the dead. Some claimed that they could see the spirits of their ancestors, that they could hear their voices in the wind or see their faces in the flickering shadows of candlelight. There were stories of family members who had been visited by the dead in their dreams, receiving messages from beyond the grave. These dreams were often seen as prophetic, a way for the spirits to impart wisdom or guidance to those still living. It was said that the family would interpret these dreams as messages, using them to make important decisions about matters such as marriage, land, and even the timing of a burial. This connection to the spiritual world, while respected by some, was terrifying to others. It suggested that the family had access to knowledge and power that no one else possessed, and that they were guided by forces that could not be understood by the average villager. The family's practices, and the rumors surrounding them, began to draw the attention of outsiders. Visitors, some of whom were scholars and anthropologists, came to the village in search of answers. They were drawn to the family's unusual customs, eager to uncover the origins of their beliefs and to understand the source of their power. These outsiders would often stay in the village for weeks, quietly observing the family from a distance, attempting to learn more about their ways. Some believed that the family was preserving an ancient tradition, one that predated the arrival of Christianity in the region. Others suspected that the family was involved in occult practices, perhaps even witchcraft. The truth, however, was elusive. The family was not interested in explaining themselves to outsiders. They did not seek fame or attention. They were content to live according to their beliefs, untouched by the outside world. It was during this period of heightened curiosity that the family's practices took a darker turn. As the years passed, the family began to grow more secretive, even more isolated. The death of another family member, this time a younger relative, was handled with even more ceremony than before. The body was prepared in a way that had not been seen in the village for generations. The family once again refrained from using a coffin, but this time they also performed a ritual that was said to be even more ancient than their burial practices. It was rumored that they had invoked the spirits of their ancestors, asking for their guidance in the afterlife. The body was said to have been placed in the earth in a specific formation, one that was believed to align with the forces of nature and the stars. The ritual was performed under the cover of night, away from the prying eyes of the village. The family had become more determined than ever to protect their customs from the encroaching modern world. Despite the secrecy, the whispers from the village grew louder. The family's refusal to conform, their insistence on following their own path, created a rift that seemed impossible to bridge. The village was divided. On one hand, there were those who believed that the family was the last bastion of an ancient, sacred tradition, and that they should be left to continue their practices in peace. On the other hand, there were those who saw them as a threat, as a danger to the social order. The fear of the unknown, the fear of what lay beyond the veil of death, was something that could not be ignored. And so, the family continued, their rituals unchanged, their beliefs unwavering. For them, the connection to their ancestors, to the spirits of the dead, was more important than the judgments of the living. They were bound by something ancient and powerful, something that transcended the fears and prejudices of the world around them. In their eyes, they were not just following an ancient as the years passed. The family's practices grew ever more enigmatic, leaving the villagers to wonder whether their customs were the result of superstition, a deep spiritual belief, or something even darker. The mysterious and unusual nature of their burial rituals began to entwine itself with the folklore and the very fabric of the village's culture. The village, once a place of quiet rural life, became a center of whispered tales and fearful speculation. The family, isolated from the social pulse of the village, became an object of both reverence and fear. They had become more than a peculiar relic of the past. They had become a symbol of something inexplicable, something that could not be easily understood or explained away. It wasn't just the burial practices that set the family apart, but their refusal to engage in any form of public life. The village's festivals, its gatherings, and even its everyday rituals were foreign to them. The family never joined in the communal celebrations, nor did they ever participate in the religious rites that most villagers observed. Instead, they lived in a world of their own making, one in which the line between life and death was far more fluid and complex than most could comprehend. It was said that their isolation wasn't born of disdain or an unwillingness to interact with others. Rather, it was a reflection of their deeply held belief that the world of the living and the world of the dead were inextricably linked. For the family, death was not an end but a continuation. They did not look at death as something to be feared or mourned. To them, it was simply a transition, a passage into a greater understanding of the world. At the heart of this belief was the idea that the dead were always with them, not just in memory but in spirit. The family maintained that their deceased ancestors, far from leaving them, continued to guide them, offering wisdom and protection in their daily lives. Their ancestors, they believed, were watching over them, always present, even if unseen. It was said that the family could hear the voices of their ancestors in the wind or in the quiet rustle of leaves. Some even believed that they could see the faces of the departed in their dreams, receiving direct communication from the other side. This belief in the ongoing presence of the dead in their lives gave the family a sense of comfort and security, but it also set them apart from the rest of the village, where such ideas were considered strange or even heretical. In the midst of their isolation, the family remained deeply connected to the land and the natural world around them. The forest that bordered their property was not simply a backdrop to their lives. It was a sacred space, a place of spiritual significance where the boundaries between the living and the dead seemed to blur. It was here that the family performed many of their rituals, particularly those associated with death and the afterlife. The burial site itself was nestled deep within the forest, a place that was both eerie and sacred. The graves were not neatly arranged in rows as they were in the village cemetery. Instead, the tombs seemed to rise up organically from the earth, as if they were a part of the landscape itself. The earth had been carefully disturbed, but the graves were not marked with crosses or stones like those of the villagers. Instead, there were only faint impressions in the earth, a subtle reminder of the dead who lay beneath. The way the family performed these rituals was as mysterious as their beliefs. No one from the outside world had ever been invited to witness the burials, but it was rumored that the family would gather at the gravesite in the dead of night, when the moon was full, to perform a series of rituals. The family would circle the grave, chanting words in a language that no one seemed to recognize, words that had been passed down through generations, perhaps dating back to ancient times. These chants were said to be part of an invocation, a way to call upon the spirits of the dead and to ensure their protection and guidance in the days to come. The family was careful to perform these rituals in silence, always avoiding any public attention. It was said that if one of the villagers stumbled upon their activities, they would immediately cease the ritual, disappearing back into the shadows of the forest without a trace. There were stories of people who, on rare occasions, had ventured into the forest to observe the family's rituals. These accounts, often passed along by second or third-hand sources, were filled with strange and chilling details. Those who had witnessed the rituals spoke of a sense of unease, a feeling that the air itself was charged with some otherworldly presence. The chanting, they said, seemed to echo in their minds long after they had left the forest, as though the words themselves were imprinted on the soul. The images of the family members, their faces half hidden in the darkness, remained vivid in the minds of those who had seen them, as though the encounter had left a lasting mark. The most unsettling accounts were those that described the family's eyes, deep, dark, and seemingly infinite, eyes that seemed to see beyond the physical world and into the very heart of the unseen. As the rumors spread, so too did the sense of mystery that surrounded the family. Some villagers began to speculate that the family was not just performing an ancient, forgotten ritual, but that they had some deeper, more forbidden connection to the dead. Perhaps they were practicing some form of necromancy, or worse, had struck a deal with dark spirits who were more than willing to provide their guidance in exchange for a price. The idea that the family could communicate with the dead, that they could somehow control the boundary between the living and the dead, filled the village with a sense of fear and awe. But there was also a sense of wonderment among some villagers. A few believed that the family had unlocked some hidden knowledge, that they were in possession of an ancient wisdom that had been lost to time. These individuals were drawn to the family, though they never dared to approach them directly. Instead, they would sometimes leave offerings at the edge of the forest, hoping to gain favor or perhaps to learn something from the family's hidden knowledge. There were even whispers of individuals who had tried to enter the forest in search of answers, only to return with wild, incoherent tales of strange visions and inexplicable experiences. For some, the family became a symbol of something deeper, a bridge between the known and the unknown, a mystery that could never fully be unraveled but was always worth pursuing. In contrast to these more fascinated villagers, there were those who believed that the family's practices were a direct challenge to the established order, to the authority of the church and the social norms that governed the village. These individuals viewed the family's refusal to conform as an affront to the values that they held dear. They feared that the family's actions were a sign of decay, a reminder that the boundaries between life and death were not as clear-cut as they had once believed. For them, the family represented chaos, an uncontrollable force that could unravel the fabric of their society. The growing tension between the family and the rest of the village culminated in a fateful meeting one winter night, when a group of villagers, led by the local priest, decided to confront the family. The priest, who had long been troubled by the family's unorthodox practices, gathered a group of villagers to march to the family's home and demand that they cease their strange rituals. The group was determined to put an end to what they viewed as a threat to their faith and their way of life. However, when they arrived at the family's home, they found it eerily silent, the windows dark and the doors closed. No one answered their knocks, and the sense of unease that had been building for so long seemed to swell in the air. Some villagers were afraid to step any further into the property, as though some invisible force was holding them back. The priest, however, pressed forward, and with a mixture of frustration and anger, he ordered the family to come out and explain themselves. But no one emerged. Instead, the group was met with the faintest sound of chanting, carried by the wind, drifting through the trees. The priest was undeterred. He demanded that the family stop their rituals immediately and come before him, but his words were lost in the wind, as though the spirits themselves had carried them away. The villagers waited in silence, watching the darkened house, but no one came. After what felt like an eternity, the group turned and left the family's property, their hearts heavy with fear and confusion. The priest's authority had been challenged, but worse still, he felt that he had witnessed something far beyond his understanding, something that could not be explained by theology or logic. And so the family's isolation continued, deepening as the years passed. The village grew more divided, caught between fear and fascination, with some trying to understand the family's way of life, while others sought to suppress it. But no matter how hard they tried, the mystery surrounding the family persisted, casting a shadow over the village that no one seemed able to dispel. The family, for their part, continued with their rituals, as steadfast and unwavering as the land itself. The boundary between the living and the dead remained fluid in their world, and they, bound by their ancient customs, continued to walk the path that had been set before them, undisturbed by the fears of the living. The family's practices, while deeply rooted in their spiritual beliefs, began to take on an even more elusive and ominous quality as the years passed. Their refusal to adhere to the expected norms of the village, coupled with their unwavering commitment to their traditions, created an atmosphere thick with mystery and uncertainty. The outside world, especially the village community, struggled to understand the family's motivations, and their inability to comprehend the family's actions only deepened the sense of fear that surrounded them. Despite the villagers' increasing unease, the family remained steadfast, continuing their rituals and maintaining an unwavering silence about the true meaning behind their practices. As time wore on, the family's position within the village became even more precarious. Though some villagers still regarded them with a mixture of awe and respect, others began to view them with growing suspicion. There were those who wondered whether the family's strange rituals were the result of madness, or whether they had crossed over into something far more dangerous. It wasn't just the fact that they buried their dead without coffins, a practice considered sacrilegious by many. It was the larger, unspoken sense of mystery that surrounded them. People could feel that the family's rituals were not just about burying the dead, but something far more profound, perhaps even supernatural. It wasn't long before rumors began to surface about the family's ability to commune with the dead. These rumors, often whispered in hushed tones, grew more elaborate with each telling. Some said that the family could call upon spirits from the other side, invoking them to gain knowledge or guidance. Others claimed that the family could see the dead, communicating with them in ways that ordinary people could never hope to understand. These rumors were not entirely unfounded. There were those who had witnessed strange occurrences, strange noises, sudden gusts of wind, and unexplained lights in the family's property at night. It was said that the family's home was always shrouded in a peculiar atmosphere, one that made outsiders feel uneasy. No one, it seemed, could truly explain what went on behind the closed doors of their house, and that was what made the family so terrifying. The most disturbing part of these rumors was the idea that the family's rituals were not just a form of veneration for the dead, but a way of exerting control over the spirits themselves. Some villagers began to wonder if the family was not merely following an ancient tradition, but if they had somehow struck a pact with the dead, one that allowed them to manipulate the forces of the afterlife. The idea of necromancy, the summoning and controlling of spirits, seemed almost too absurd to be believed, yet it lingered in the minds of those who had been exposed to the family's strange ways. If they could communicate with the dead so easily, some wondered, could they also summon them, bend them to their will? As the rumors swirled, the villagers began to take note of the family's unusual behavior even in the daylight. They were rarely seen in public, and when they were, they appeared out of place, almost like ghosts walking among the living. Their clothes were simple, but always seemed to be slightly out of step with the current trends of the time. Their eyes, deep and unreadable, gave little away. There was something unsettling about the way they moved through the village, as if they were always slightly detached from the world around them, as if they existed in a different plane of reality altogether. This sense of otherness became even more pronounced as the family continued to distance themselves from the villagers' everyday life. What troubled the villagers most, however, was the family's relationship with death itself. Where others mourned the passing of loved ones, the family treated death as a natural part of the cycle of life, something that could not be feared or avoided. Their funerals, if they could even be called that, were stark and devoid of emotion. There were no tears, no outpourings of grief. The body was simply laid to rest in the earth without ceremony, without prayer, without the comforting rituals that other villagers were accustomed to. To the outside world, it seemed like a cold, heartless practice. But to the family, it was simply the way things had always been done. Death, they believed, was not an ending but a transition, a passage to something beyond. The villagers, unable to understand the family's perspective, began to view their behavior as unnatural. It was said that the family seemed immune to the emotional toll of death. While everyone around them mourned, they simply carried on with their lives, unaffected by the loss. It was as though they had come to accept death as an inevitable and necessary part of existence. Some villagers even began to believe that the family had no capacity for grief, that they had somehow transcended the human experience of loss and were now operating on a higher plane. This idea was terrifying to many, as it suggested that the family had become something other than human, something beyond the realm of normal understanding.